You already know this person. Maybe you are this person. You're the one who stays late to help when everyone else has already left. You're the one who picks up the phone at 11 at night because someone is struggling. You give your time, your energy, your attention, not because you're naive, not because you don't see what's happening, but because it genuinely feels wrong to do otherwise. Kindness, for you, is not a strategy. It's just who you are. And yet, there's a specific kind of exhaustion that follows people like you. Not the tiredness that comes from hard work. Something quieter. The feeling of looking around one day and realizing that the same people you have poured yourself into are not there when the cup is empty. They took what you offered. And when there was nothing left to take, they found someone else to stand next to. This is not a story about being naive. It is a story about a dynamic that Nietzsche saw clearly more than a century ago, and named with a precision that still cuts. If this is already landing, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. Friedrich Nietzsche was not a gentle philosopher. He did not write for people who wanted reassurance. He wrote for people who were willing to see things as they were, even when the truth was uncomfortable. One of his most important observations, and one of the least talked about, was his analysis of what he called the morality of pity. Mitleid in German. Literally, suffering with. Nietzsche did not believe pity was a virtue. He thought it was a mechanism, and he thought the people most vulnerable to being used were not the foolish or the weak. They were the ones with the greatest capacity for care, people who felt the pain of others so directly that they could not turn away from it. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he wrote about the danger of those who give endlessly, that their giving does not come from abundance, but from an inability to refuse, and that this inability, however genuine, invites exploitation. This is the thing that most conversations about kindness miss entirely. They frame the problem as a failure of intelligence. You were too trusting. You didn't see the signs. But Nietzsche's diagnosis was more specific and more unsettling than that. He argued that the problem was not a lack of perception. It was the presence of something real, a genuine moral instinct that other people learned to read and exploit. You were not used because you were blind. You were used because you were good, and because someone recognized that goodness and decided it was available. 1. The kindest person in the room rarely says no, and everyone can feel it. This is the first mechanism, and it operates before a single word is spoken. There is something in the posture of a genuinely kind person that registers in a room. Not weakness exactly, something softer. Availability. The sense that if you approach this person with a need, they will not turn you away. Nietzsche wrote about what he called the will to power. Not domination in the crude sense, but the fundamental human drive to expand, to assert, to act on the world rather than simply receive it. In every social environment, that drive is searching for its easiest path. And the person who cannot say no is the easiest path there is. Think about the last time you agreed to something you didn't want to do. Not because you were forced, because the discomfort of saying no, the person's potential disappointment, the slight shift in the air, the image of yourself as someone who refuses, felt worse than just saying yes. That calculus happens in seconds. And the people around you run that calculus too. They learn quickly which people cause something to ask and which people don't. The kindest person in the room becomes the person everyone asks. Not always because they're seen as capable, though they often are, because the social cost of asking them is low. They've never made a high. This is not a character flaw. It is the logical consequence of genuinely caring about other people's feelings more than your own comfort. But Nietzsche's point was that a moral instinct, no matter how real, does not protect you from its consequences. The person being used is not less good than the person doing the using. They are just operating without a mechanism the other person has quietly developed. 2. Genuine care is mistaken for unconditional availability. There's a difference between being kind and being available without limit. Most people who are being used do not understand that distinction until they've already been drained. The confusion happens because the early stages of being depended upon feel like connection. Someone shares something difficult with you. You listen fully. They feel seen. They come back. You listen again. A pattern establishes itself, and at no point in that pattern does either person formally agree to the terms. You never said, "I will always be here." They never said, "I will need you indefinitely." But the relationship has a shape now, and the shape places all the weight on one side. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who spent his early life as a slave, understood dependency from both directions. In the discourses, he drew a sharp line between what is yours and what is not. Your judgment, your response, your chosen actions, these are yours. Everything outside that circle, including other people's needs and other people's expectations, is not. He was not advocating for indifference. He was describing a structural fact. When you allow someone else's needs to define your obligations without ever choosing that relationship consciously, you have given away the one thing that was always supposed to stay yours. The kind person does not do this deliberately. They do it incrementally, one yes at a time, until the yes is expected, and then until it is assumed, and then until its absence becomes a wound they are responsible for. That last step is where the real trap is. When your availability becomes someone else's expectation, your failure to meet it is experienced by them, genuinely experienced, as betrayal. You haven't changed, but the relationship has reclassified what you owe, and you never agreed to that reclassification. You were just never asked. 3. They come to you with weight, and they leave without it, but it doesn't disappear. Here is the mechanics of it, in plain terms. Emotional weight does not vanish when it is shared. It redistributes. You know this already, somewhere. You've had conversations where a friend arrived visibly burdened. Something at work, something at home, a relationship falling apart. And by the end of an hour with you, they seemed lighter. They laughed at something. They said they felt better. And they left. And you sat with something you hadn't had before they arrived. Carl Jung described what he called the shadow. The parts of a person's inner life they are unwilling to hold consciously. One of the shadow's most common functions is projection, pushing the unacceptable parts of yourself outward, onto others, so you don't have to carry them. Not every person who leans on a kind person is doing this deliberately, but many are doing it structurally. They have learned, consciously or not, that certain people can hold what they cannot. The kind person becomes a container, not because they're weak, precisely because they're strong enough to hold it without visibly breaking. And that capacity, that strength, becomes the thing that is exploited. The person who processes their pain privately, who doesn't burden others, who keeps moving, that person gets loaded again and again because they appear to have room. Jung's point was not that you should refuse to hold anything for anyone. His point was that what you take on without awareness becomes yours. The weight transfers and stays. And a person who takes on weight without knowing it is happening cannot make a conscious choice about whether the exchange is worth it. 4. Kindness without conditions is read as kindness without cost. Nietzsche's concept of raisonnement is usually discussed in political or moral terms. The way a group that cannot act outwardly turns its frustration inward and builds a moral system that condemns those who can. But there's a quieter version of it operating in personal relationships, and it runs in the opposite direction. The person who is being used rarely harbors resentment toward the kind person. What they feel often is something closer to entitlement, not the aggressive entitlement of someone making demands. The passive entitlement of someone who has never been made to consider what things cost. If you have always been available, your availability is the baseline. It is not experienced as a gift. It is experienced as the weather. And no one thanks the weather. This is the point that most hurts when it becomes visible. You were generous. You were consistent. You showed up every time. And the person you showed up for does not feel grateful, because gratitude requires recognizing that something was given, and they never experienced it as given. They experienced it as simply there. Nietzsche was severe on this point. He believed that a gift which asks nothing in return, extended indefinitely, ultimately degrades both parties. The giver loses the sense of their own value. The receiver loses the capacity to recognize it. Neither outcome is kindness in any meaningful sense. It is a system that wears the face of kindness while producing something closer to mutual diminishment. If this video is giving you something to think about, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It helps us keep making content like this. 5. The moment you show need, the dynamic reveals itself. This is the one most people already know, but have never said out loud. The clearest test of any relationship that has operated on the kindness without cost model is the moment the kind person actually needs something in return. Not something large. It does not have to be a crisis. Just reciprocity. Just the simple human expectation that a person who has received consistently will give something back when asked. What happens, more often than not, is a form of absence. Not cruelty. Absence. The person is unavailable, or they half engage, or they turn the conversation with genuine fluency back to themselves. Not because they are malicious, because they have never had to develop the muscle. They have been in the role of receiver for so long that the role of giver is, for them, genuinely unfamiliar territory. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations about what he called the obstacle to action. His argument was that the impediment itself reveals something. It is not separate from the situation, it is information about the situation. The moment your need is met with absence is not the moment the relationship broke. It is the moment the relationship became visible. What was always there is now apparent. The architecture was built for one kind of traffic. You were the road. They were the vehicle. And roads, Marcus might have noted, do not require the maintenance of the things that travel on them. They simply bear the weight until they crack. 6. The kindest people are often the last to name what is happening to them. This is the most uncomfortable point, not because it implicates the people doing the using, but because it implicates the person being used. There is a specific kind of self-deception that operates in genuinely kind people. It is not stupidity. It is something more subtle, a resistance to the conclusion that seeing the pattern clearly would force. Because if you see it, if you name it, if you say the words out loud, then you have to decide what to do about it. And deciding what to do about it means accepting that some relationships, ones you have invested in deeply, are structured in a way that cannot be fixed by more kindness. That is a loss. And kind people, almost by definition, are people who work hard to avoid causing loss, including the loss that comes from withdrawing. Nietzsche had a name for the psychological state that results from this avoidance. He called it bad conscience, a condition in which a person turns their instinct for self-assertion inward against themselves rather than outward into action. The person with bad conscience does not stop feeling the thing they need to feel. They simply redirect it. They call their own needs excessive. They tell themselves the other person is going through something difficult. They find a frame that allows them to stay generous and call it a virtue, when what it actually is, if they were honest, is fear. Fear of conflict. Fear of being seen as cold. Fear of becoming the kind of person who keeps score. But here is what Nietzsche would say directly, without softening it. The refusal to see a thing clearly is not kindness. It is a failure of courage dressed in the language of care. And it costs you not just energy and time. It costs you the accuracy of your own judgment, which is the one thing you need most if you are ever going to change anything. The kind person who cannot name what is happening to them is not protecting the relationship. They're protecting the story they have about themselves. The story that says, I'm not the kind of person who walks away. I'm not the kind of person who says this isn't working. I'm not the kind of person who puts myself first. That story feels like integrity. It functions like a cage. Now we arrive at the turn. And I want to be clear about what it is and what it isn't. This is not the part where you are told to stop being kind. Nietzsche was not advocating for coldness. He was not suggesting that care is weakness or that generosity should be abandoned. What he was arguing, and thus spoke Zarathustra in Beyond Good and Evil across his entire body of work, was that a value only means something when it is chosen. A kindness that cannot be withheld is not kindness. It is compulsion. And compulsion, however well-intentioned, is not a virtue. It is an absence of choice. The shift is not from kind to hard. The shift is from unconscious to deliberate. There is a version of generosity that comes from abundance, from a person who is full enough that giving costs them something but does not drain them. And there's a version that comes from an inability to refuse, from a person who gives because the alternative feels unbearable. From the outside, these two things look identical. The same actions, the same availability, the same care. But they are structurally different. One is a choice made from strength. The other is a compulsion operating beneath the threshold of awareness. Epictetus would frame it as a question of what you have actually agreed to. Not what you have done, not what has been established by habit or expectation, but what you would consciously choose if the choice were laid out plainly. Would you choose to be the person this relationship has made you? Would you choose these terms if someone handed them to you on paper? Most people, asked that directly, would say no, not because they don't care, but because the terms, seen clearly, are not what they would select. They drifted into them one small yes at a time. The usable shift is this. Begin to notice the difference between giving from choice and giving from the inability to stop. You do not have to announce it. You do not have to confront anyone. You do not have to change your behavior dramatically in a single moment. But the moment you can feel the difference, the moment you can identify in real time whether a yes is coming from your values or from your discomfort with the alternative, you have recovered something essential. You have recovered authorship of your own generosity. And when that happens, something else follows. The people in your life who are drawn to your availability begin to encounter something they haven't encountered before. A person who is kind, but not without limit. A person who gives, but not automatically. A person whose yes means something, because a no is possible. Some of them will adjust. They will meet you differently, with more consideration, more reciprocity, because the old dynamic is no longer available to them. These are the people worth keeping. Others will leave. Not dramatically. They will simply become less present, because the thing they were drawing on is no longer flowing freely. Let them. Their absence is not evidence that you did something wrong. It is evidence that the relationship was built on something you no longer want to offer. Nietzsche's answer to the problem of the kind person being used was not to become someone who does not care. It was to become someone who cares on their own terms. The Übermensch, the concept he returned to again and again, was not a person without feeling. It was a person who had stopped allowing the expectations of others to define what their feeling required of them. This is harder than it sounds. It requires tolerating the discomfort of being seen differently. The person who is always available is now occasionally unavailable, and that will register. Some people will be confused. A few will be hurt. And the instinct of the kind person will be to smooth it over, to explain, to give more so the withdrawal is not felt. Resist that. Not forever, not rigidly, but enough to let the new shape of things settle. Because the truth is that genuine respect, the kind that holds over time, the kind that survives difficulty, does not grow in a relationship where one person has no visible limit. It grows in the space between two people who each know that the other could leave and choose to stay. There is a particular quality of loneliness that comes with being the kindest person in any room. It is not the loneliness of isolation. It is the loneliness of being surrounded by people who need you and none of whom actually see you. Who see, instead, what you can provide, and who have, through no conscious cruelty, quietly come to treat those two things as the same. You are not what you provide. You are not the function you serve in other people's lives. Nietzsche's entire philosophical project, at its most human level, was an argument against allowing the definitions of others to become the definition of yourself. Become who you are, he wrote, not who the needs of others have slowly shaped you into. The kindest thing you can do for yourself is to stop being endlessly available to people who have mistaken your availability for your identity. Not because they are bad, because they are confused, and you have, for a long time, helped them stay confused by never showing them anything different. Show them something different. The people who deserve your kindness will not be threatened by the fact that it has edges. They will be relieved, because edges mean the thing is real, that it comes from a person, not from a mechanism. That when you show up, you chose to show up, and that choice means something. The room will be quieter, maybe smaller, but the people left in it will know what they have. Thank you for watching. More videos are on your screen now, and if you haven't already, subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.